4, 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to this special edition of Dakhel Washington. I'm delighted to have with us today Assistant Secretary of State Barbara Leaf. Ambassador Leaf, Secretary Leaf, was the senior American diplomat with responsibility for the entire Middle East. In our system, that goes from Morocco all the way through Iran. And I'm delighted that she could be with us today for an extensive conversation on your experience throughout the Biden administration. Barbara, welcome.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
So the big news of the day, we'll start with that, which is the ceasefire announced that we hope gets implemented very shortly between Israel and Hamas. This has been more or less on the table for quite some time. What brought it over the finish line, in your view?
So that seems to be the question on everyone's lips. Look, I think there were a number of factors. You heard the president say it's essentially the deal that he put forward in late May last year. But I think a number of factors played into this. Of course, how things have changed in the Middle East in the last 4 to 5 months. Hamas is more depleted than ever. Hezbollah is, if not gone, it is very much a shattered organization. Bashar al-Assad is gone. So the so-called ring of fire that Iran has spent decades erecting is suddenly in tatters. But I think, frankly, to my mind, the most important pieces of the puzzle are the fact that the outgoing and the incoming administrations worked together clearly, visibly, as one team. That was an extraordinary thing to do, and it took us over the finish line.
That's highly unusual, and I've been in Washington for 40 years. This doesn't happen very often.
Well, I will say this. From my perspective, going back 3+ decades of diplomatic service, it used to be the case that that bipartisanship started at the edge of the water, or at least politics ended at the edge of the water, which is to say that there was a commonality of purpose when it came to critical national security issues. It is unusual to literally have a team from the outgoing and a team from the incoming administration work together. You're absolutely right. It was the key factor.
The deal envisions 3 phases. Are you confident that it will get all the way through to the end and we will have a full end to the war in Gaza?
No. Look, I think it is a wonderful day. It was a wonderful day yesterday. It will be still more wonderful on Sunday when those first hostages come home. But it is going to be very tough to put together the terms for the enduring peace, for the enduring departure of Israeli forces, for the end of the conflict. It's what we struggled with all of the past year. And Secretary Blinken laid out quite clearly the other day at the Atlantic Council that there is the possibility of a plan to bring this all to an end. But it was not something that we could get agreement to ultimately. And so it will be extraordinarily tough to go from phase 1 to phase 2.
I have to say, in my view, I agree with that completely. It's a real uphill battle. Yes. One can imagine phase 1, and then it becomes far more complicated. That's right. And that leads me to this question about the day after. Mm-hmm. As you said, the secretary recently gave a speech outlining the American policy, the American vision for a day after. Are we at that point yet, or are we still before the day after?
We are still very much before. According to the terms of the agreement, just as was outlined months ago, the negotiators will begin that piece of it about 2 weeks into the first phase. And as long as they are showing seriousness of purpose, the negotiations are moving along, the negotiators, the mediators, will ensure, if they can, that it will continue beyond the initial phase 1. But we worked, as I said, all last year on putting forward ideas. And what are those ideas? They are the critical pieces: security, governance, reconstruction, helping the people of Gaza find their way back onto the road, a long road of recovery. But you have to have security, you have to have governance. Who are to do those two tasks? To my mind, and as you heard the secretary say the other day, the logical partners to this affair are the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli government, assisted, supported, maybe pressured by a collection of like-minded partners. But it starts with those two pieces. Otherwise, you have the very strange optic of the two parties who are discussing the terms of post-conflict Gaza are Hamas and the Israeli government, which to my mind doesn't make a lot of sense.
So you just mentioned the Palestinian Authority, which is, of course, not one of the combatants in the conflict in Gaza. I guess whether or not one is a critic or an advocate of the Palestinian Authority, it's sort of difficult to imagine its future is under the poster child of the 89-year-old Mahmoud Abbas. When you think of the development, the future of the Palestinian Authority, the concept of a reformed Palestinian Authority, what does that mean to you? What should we be looking for?
So look, I think it's less what we should be looking for. What do the Palestinian people themselves demand, require? For one thing, there has to be a generational change. There has to be an opening up of that system of a new blood, new figures coming to the fore. There has to be a cleaning of house. There has to be a ridding of corruption and a raising of the game of competency and governance. That has no doubt been a priority for Palestinians for years. They haven't had a vote as such. But if we wait forever for that day when it is closer to the kind of model that Palestinians themselves would like to see, if we say that you can't discuss the terms of governance and security for Gaza until such a day, then effectively you never get Israeli forces out of Gaza. You never get to that post-conflict point. And I doubt very much the people of Israel want to see the young men and women in Gaza forever.
So in your vision, or not your vision, but in a vision that has a post-conflict Gaza, the Palestinian Authority becomes the principal Palestinian partner for governance and administration.
Who else is Israel going to negotiate with? You can't negotiate with foreign parties about the terms of who's going to run things if you don't include the Palestinian Authority as a central piece of it, which is not to say that they are the sole piece of security or governance. They will need a lot of support. But I frankly can't see why, I can't see an alternative.
Big picture question. You've been doing this a long time, which is not to suggest that.
I know where you're going with that, Rob.
Is a negotiated solution to this conflict still possible, in your view?
Yes. With the political will, yes, absolutely.
In a time frame that people can feel and see.
Yes, absolutely. Anything is possible, and certainly that is possible, but it takes extraordinary political will, political courage, making extraordinarily tough decisions on both sides. Yes, it's possible.
Okay. Let's move on to another topic, because we have lots of topics to discuss. You were the senior American official to travel to Damascus to meet the new leader of Syria, or at least the prospective leader of a new Syria, Ahmed Ashara, Mr. Jolani, as he sometimes prefers to be known. Tell us a bit about your trip to Damascus. Tell us a bit about your meeting with the leader of Hayat Tahrir Sham, and then we'll talk a little bit more broadly about how you think America should approach the prospect of a new Syria.
So I will say it was an extraordinary day for me personally, for me professionally. It was an extraordinarily moving day from the morning to the evening when we left. I went to Damascus with Roger Carstens, the special presidential envoy for hostage affairs, and with a good friend and colleague, Ambassador Daniel Rubinstein, whom the Secretary Blinken, had tapped to come in to do a bit of work on Syria for us. We went with several missions. We were accompanied by a small FBI team. One of the crucial pieces of the mission that day was to see whether we could add to our knowledge of the whereabouts of Austin Tice, a young American who disappeared into the detention facilities of the Syrian regime in 2012. And that quest to find Austin, to find other American citizens who disappeared into the cauldron of the Syrian civil war, was one of the most important pieces of the day. So the day started with that. We went to a detention facility that we had good reason to believe, had been the detention site for Austin possibly twice. I laid a wreath at the site of the compound in the memory of all who'd lost their lives, been detained, been killed, been disappeared under Bashar al-Assad's regime. Roger and the team did their work. Then we jumped in the car. We went to the Four Seasons, where we had a really joyous reunion with all of the local staff who had worked all of these years to safeguard our mission, the embassy and the chancery, and the residents, and who were waiting for our return. And then we met with the White Helmets, who of course have done heroic work on behalf of the Syrian people for 13 long years. And then we had another meeting with an array of Syrian civil society activists. And we capped the day, of course, with the meeting with Ahmed al-Shara. I would say the following about the discussion. It was thoroughgoing. It was a tough set of topics, but a very productive and constructive first go at a dialogue. Daniel has continued these discussions over the last couple of weeks, and we've hit every major topic of interest to the United States, and I dare say of interest to the Syrian people and to the neighborhood. First of all, the quest again for the missing. Not only our missing, but he in turn asked for our help in determining in getting to the bottom of all those who had lost their lives, Syrians who'd lost their lives and disappeared. We talked about ISIS. We talked about the counterterrorism fight. We talked about U.S. sanctions. We talked about governance. We talked about just about every topic under the sun. And as I say, we had a very frank, on both sides, candid exchange.
All right. Lots of questions emerge from this. First, the search for Austin Tice, progress?
We don't have an answer yet. I would say it was a good first step. Certainly, we welcome the fact that HTS had facilitated our access, and Shara pledged that he would continue to support this quest, not just for Austin but for others. So I can't really say that we have certainly not determined Austin's whereabouts. That is a subject of just unending anguish for his family, but I am quite confident the incoming administration will pick it up.
Ahmed al-Shara, you've met lots of people in your career. How did he come across?
Extremely thoughtful, not overly polished, but somebody who had prepared quite a bit for this encounter. That was clear. He had very detailed comments to make, detailed questions to ask. He had anticipated pretty much the whole checklist of things that I brought to the table, and he had a few items of his own. But what I found was a very pragmatic cast of mind, and somebody who seemed keenly aware already, and this was not quite 2 weeks in, seemed keenly aware of just the monumental challenges ahead.
His organization has been on the foreign terrorist organization list for quite some time. In your view, did he appreciate what that means and what it would take to be removed from that list?
Yes, and he had obviously looked in detail at our sanctions regimens, and there's not just one set of sanctions. It's not just the foreign terrorist organization issue for HTS, nor the specially designated global terrorist designation for him personally. There's a Caesar Act. There's a state sponsor of terrorism designation going back to 1979. He focused on Caesar and on a state sponsor of terrorism as two pieces that he hopes to see lifted from Syria. And we talked in detail about what it would take to do that.
Now, I gather the United States has decided not to pursue the bounty on Mr. Shara. Did he expect more than that?
No, not at that first meeting, and I don't think he expected that, frankly. So there was a good bit of good-natured joking about that. But obviously, it stood to reason that if we're going to have a dialogue with the man, that we wouldn't keep a bounty hanging over his head.
And what, in your view, is the path here? What do you think he and the new government need to do to satisfy, say, the new administration, which is going to have to make these decisions, to normalize a relationship with the new leadership in Syria?
Well, look, I think the most critical pieces at the outset, I would guess, for the new administration are going to be in the counterterrorism domain. And there will be things, just as with Sudan in 2020. The Trump administration then laid out a pathway, a roadmap for Sudan to basically walk itself out of that designation as a state sponsor of terrorism. So there's certain things they will have to do and certain things they will have to stop doing. It's pretty clear from that first discussion, and I think even from his public comments, that he and his organization, his government, are ready to take up the fight against ISIS. But there will be many other pieces of the counterterrorism puzzle that will have to fall into place. And it will, as I say, be for the Trump administration to design that roadmap.
3 years for a constitution, 4 years for an election. Did these sound reasonable to you?
So look, these were notional timelines that he put out there. To my knowledge, there's no scripted plan as such, and I think this will be an issue of tremendous debate for the Syrian public. Civil society is letting its views be known. I wouldn't judge so much whether 3 versus 2 versus 4 is reasonable. It's again going to be a test for the public. There are many things to do before you have elections, for instance, a census to figure out who you even have in the country anymore. But there will be many other pieces to that puzzle as well.
All right, I have lots more Syria questions. We're going to come back in just a moment. We're going to continue our interview with Assistant Secretary of State, Barbara Leaf. Welcome back. I'm sitting here with Assistant Secretary of State Barbara Leaf. We're talking about Syria. Let's take a step back. The remarkable, near overnight collapse of the regime of Bashar al-Assad. Did anyone see this coming? Did we see this coming?
So I would say the following. Nobody I've spoken to within the region, and I checked in with everyone, no one saw it coming. If you go back and look at some of the early comments in the first few days of the onslaught of the 10, 11-day campaign, and immediately after Bashar fled, HTS fighters themselves were shocked at the speed with which the Syrian army collapsed. So, no, we didn't see it coming, but really nobody saw it coming. You know, I think lots of us thought that those chickens would come home to roost eventually in Syria. Again, all of the different things that had occurred in the region in the previous 4 or 5 months would ultimately have their effect in a wider sense, from Hezbollah to Iran being stymied in its efforts to attack Israel. But the speed, the total collapse, the just sort of flight of the Syrian army, no, that was shocking.
Did anybody think that the Russians were going to come and help him, or the Iranians would pull some rabbit out of their hat? Because nobody showed up.
Nobody showed up. And it did seem, so I think that was almost the less surprising piece of it. We knew how strapped Russia was by its exploits, its bogged down, its quagmire state in Ukraine. We knew how flummoxed the regime in Tehran was over the preceding several months of events, especially what had occurred to Hezbollah. But it was really something to see how paralyzed, in a sense, they both were.
All right, a few big picture questions about Syria. What's in our interest when we think about the future of Syria? A strong, centralized government, a more decentralized, perhaps even federal government where the Kurds can run their own area. Now, of course, this is ultimately up to the Syrians, but we can have preferences.
So look, I have spent 35 plus years in one transitional country after another, one post-conflict country after another. And one thing I've seen is that it is extraordinarily difficult for both the societies and the government that takes over to effectuate a stable transition when the country has come out of decades of a highly centralized, brutal regime like you saw between Hafez and Bashar al-Assad. The society itself, the members of the society themselves don't quite know how to act with each other, in community terms with each other, and what to expect or demand of the government. So there's a very high failure rate, frankly. We don't want Syria to fail. We don't want Syria to become a black hole, a sort of chaotic, disaggregated kind of state, right? That's easy to delineate what we don't want. I think this question of what Syria should be in terms of state structure, again, this is really, we can come up with all sorts of diagrams and designs and so forth, but really think about what Syria has become over this last 10, 11 years. Very much a cantonized country. At one point, the regime had no more than a control over no more than 30% of the country. By the end of Bashar's term, he had perhaps 65 to 70% of the country under his loose control, but not more than that. So there are parts of the country that have been well out of central government control for years. I think it would probably be very difficult to construct a highly centralized approach. And on the other hand, I certainly heard there, as I have in the past in Iraq, a certain anxiety and a mistrust of the notion of federalism because it's viewed as a sort of a slippery slope to secessionism, to encouraging communities like the Kurds to secede. So I think they're going to struggle to figure out the right mix. I think there is a formula that lies somewhere between those two models that they're going to possibly struggle to effectuate. And our job should be to help from the sidelines, I think, with a community of like-minded states.
Okay. Like-minded states. That's a good lead-in for my next question. Turkey. Is Turkey a like-minded state? How concerned should we be that the leader of Turkey, Erdogan, is the patron of this great change in Syria? Is this part of some larger Turkish design that might be problematic for American interests? Or is this a NATO partner with whom we should just be working closely to bring about the right sort of change in Syria?
No, I don't think we have anything to be concerned about in terms of Turkey's relations with Syria. This new Syria, and we are again only in the first stages of what this new Syria is going to become. There's an interim government authorities who will, in some still unknown process, transition to a transitional government. There will be many way stations. What I found that day and what I've felt in talking to Syrians both inside and outside the country since then is a strong whiff of Syrian nationalism, a desire no longer, never again, to be the playing field of other countries, to be dominated by any one or two or three countries. So I'm not concerned.
Okay. U.S. forces. So we have kept U.S. forces in Syria, in parts of Syria. When you look at the situation today, given all the change in the last few months, is the rationale, in your view, greater to keep these forces because of the rising threat of ISIS, or is the rationale lesser because Iran's proxy network is in disarray and there's a new regime in Damascus?
Look, this is a period of extraordinary peril and opportunity. There is peril because, as I said, a transition like this abruptly from such a system to something yet unformed is fraught with risk. And what are those risks for Syria? The resurgence of ISIS is one of them, very certainly. You have spores of ISIS that are coming out of the Badia Desert. There's a presence in the northeast, which the Kurds and we have been contesting for some time. But on the other hand, for the first time that we could see, there's a possibility of a pathway to be designed for troops to turn over this task to Damascus itself. I don't think, look, it'll be something that the new administration, the new president will have to deliberate over. The risk of ISIS regenerating in this time is high. So the imperative or the national security interest for the U.S. is to keep that pressure on. And that was part of the discussion I had with Ashara. Keep the pressure on. Do a managed transition with the SDF. They are a great fighting force. Yes, they should be part of a national army, national security force, but make sure you do it in such a way that does not lessen the pressure on ISIS.
And just to be clear, did Ahmed Ashara request the removal of American troops? No. Okay. Another big topic. There are so many in the last several months. It's difficult to create a hierarchy. But how can we not spend some time on the remarkable change in Lebanon? Prospects for Lebanon-Israel ceasefire, full implementation. How do you see the opportunities now in Lebanon?
The opportunities are huge. And the more so because you have side by side something new, something as a set of opportunities in Syria. And as you know, Rob, Syria and Lebanon have had a tragically intertwined history over these last 4 decades in particular. And the presence, the predatory presence of the Syrian army and the military security forces has been overwhelming, has been destructive in Lebanon. Lebanon's free of that for the first time. And while Hezbollah is still a force and it still has aspirations to regenerate, it is a much diminished force. And we saw that just in the election of Joseph Aoun as president and the selection of Nawaf Salam as prime minister. So I have high hopes. I really do.
Now, analysts seem to be of two minds. Some are euphoric about the change in Lebanon, and some are cautiously optimistic. And then there's a small, but I'd say loud but small group which say, "Watch out, the Lebanese. They're so bad about doing their own politics, they will miss this opportunity, and Hezbollah will make a comeback somehow." Between these three various options, where would you put yourself?
So look, I'm fairly optimistic. And again, because of what's happened next door in Syria. If you still had Bashar al-Assad there, I would say Hezbollah is going to sort of fall back a bit, rest and refit, count on the support from next door, and reinsert itself, not give up the game. I think the events in Damascus on December 8th have been shattering. The PGM superhighway is shattered.
Precision guidance missiles.
Exactly.
Iran
all
to
of the
Hezbollah.
lethal aid that Iran trafficked across Syrian soil, it's gone. So Hezbollah is staggered by this. It is not down and out by no means. But again, the changes next door, I think, can have a profound effect on Lebanon. And this is why my advice to the incoming team is don't step back. Don't step back from either country. Engage fully diplomatically with both countries.
The American role in the implementation of the ceasefire is significant.
Yes.
Could you say a word about this?
Well, it is significant, and there's a civilian component and a military component. And this is where there will be continuity on the military side and waiting to hear what will happen on the civilian side.
Think big for a moment. 5 years from now, can we imagine Lebanon-Israel peace?
I can imagine Syrian-Israeli peace.
With under the leadership of Ahmed Ashara?
Well, I don't know that it will necessarily be Ashara who's in the seat. There will be a transition. Is he going to run for president? I don't know. But I can imagine the terms for such a peace.
In generally what time frame?
Oh, I would say sometime in the next 5 years, because of course things will be affected by what happens on the Palestinian account.
Okay, well, you heard it here first. All right, when we come back after the break, we're going to turn to Iran, a country we've mentioned in passing, but which is connected to everything we've spoken about so far, in just a moment. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. We're here with Assistant Secretary Barbara Leaf. Barbara, Iran. It is connected to everything we've been speaking about so far. Remarkable turnabout in its fortunes. On October 8th, 2023, it looked like Iran was on the march. Its partners, its proxies attacked Israel from the south, from the north. Its proxy strategy seemed to be working. And then today, its proxy strategy is in tatters. How is this being felt in Iran itself when you look at what's going on inside Tehran?
So I think there is concern, anxiety, a certain lashings of fear, anxiety that these ripples that we've seen across this part of the region, Lebanon, Syria, those ripples could come straight over to Iran. The fact that Iran's proxies are talking openly in a derogatory fashion about the failure of Iran to show up and stand by its longstanding ally. So I think those ripples, those become tidal waves possibly. And how does it affect the public view of the regime? I can imagine lots of Iranians asking themselves, what was this all about? Where did my money go? What was the government doing all of these
You mean
years?
all the funding of the proxies?
Exactly. A lot of death and destruction.
Do we think that Iran is as vulnerable as Bashar al-Assad turned out to be?
Hard to say. Very hard to say. Possibly not, but these regimes tend to have a certain brittleness that is not evident to those externally. And when they break suddenly.
Where do you think the leadership of Iran is going to go next? I mean, there's a debate out there in the punditry that Iran may have to go nuclear to compensate for its loss of the proxies and the sense of vulnerability, or Iran will do a deal with the incoming administration to preserve its, the revolution, the regime. Where do you think Iran is likely to head?
I don't think, there has been this fear for a couple of years that Iran would just bolt for weaponization. I think all of the incidents, the events of the last 6 months make that less likely in the near term. The prospect of the new president, the new administration coming in, it's a point where the regime, where Tehran will really want to assess what the next play is in the region for this administration. How large will the region figure for the Trump administration? A lot of unknowns. If you consider that ultimately Khamenei, the supreme leader's first and last thoughts are about regime survival, I doubt he's going to test the Trump administration right off the bat. But he has to think about succession. So I rather think succession is weighing uppermost in his mind these days. The regional adventures, the misadventures, it's not to say that Tehran will not attempt to re-engage and regenerate some of that proxy activity, but for the moment, it's a failed set of cards.
On the other side of the equation, you've seen how the Israelis have changed their approach to the region in the last number of months. There's a sense of buoyancy, of possibility. Lots of talk among Israelis that we've success in Hezbollah, maybe previous success against Iran's air defenses with the Israeli air attacks. Maybe now is the time for an Israeli strike against Iran's nuclear facilities. As you look at that internal debate, do you think that's a real possibility?
No, I don't. I think there's a lot of talk, as there always is in that very lively democracy, but no, I don't think so. For one thing, this is not something Israel can do alone. That this would very much depend on Washington's support, if not active engagement, and I don't see that being in the cards for the Trump administration in the first year in office.
All right. Let's go back to around the horn in the Middle East, and I want to ask you about Saudi Arabia. Now, you were in the Biden White House at the very beginning, as you were getting through the nomination process and the confirmation process, and so you were there at the very beginning when relations between Washington and Riyadh were frigid. I mean, these were the days of Mohammed bin Salman as pariah, in the words of senior administration officials. And we end up almost signing a unprecedented mutual defense treaty with Saudi Arabia. How did that change happen?
patient, methodical, personal, sometimes diplomacy, and setting expectations, resetting transparency in the relationship. But it was above all just the patient, constant, methodical, diplomatic engagement. And yeah, things were quite frosty at the front end. But one of the things that the president set out as a goal, if you recall, I think it was February 4th, his first public remarks on foreign policy at the State Department were that he was going to work to bring the war in Yemen to an end. Now, that was different from what he'd said on the campaign trail in the sense that, if I recall, it was something to the effect of cutting off arms. He went several steps much further, which was to say, let's not just cut weaponry off. Let's try to end the war itself and help this partner move on that path, Saudi Arabia. He appointed an envoy, and we put a tremendous amount of effort into doing something that is held till now, which is a de facto truce. Even if the Houthi, for their own reasons, began using the Red Sea for a shooting gallery, but we brought the war itself to an end.
Do you think a U.S.-Saudi mutual defense treaty is a good idea for the United States?
Yes, I do. I do. And I think you can construct things in such a way that the benefit is two ways. It's not one way. And certainly what we were working on to effectuate would have been brought great dividends to the United States.
We came close before October 7th to the Big Bang Israel-Saudi America three-way normalization defense treaty, civil nuclear Big Bang agreement. We didn't get there. How much further are we away because of the Gaza war?
So look, I mean, the new administration will make its own determination whether it wants to sort of take what was negotiated as it was finished, or they want to set different terms. But the one piece, the very significant piece of unfinished business, was on the Palestinian piece of the package. And that piece is extraordinarily tough to get after under the best of circumstances. And of course, with the conflict in Gaza, it's been clear from the discussions with the Crown Prince that he's made clear his requirements, that the war be over, that all Israeli forces be out of Gaza, but that there be a very significant starting point, sort of a jumping off point to a road to Palestinian statehood. So I don't know what the new administration is, how they're going to concoct or put together a package. I don't know what those elements will be. I don't know that they'll be the same elements, but I do know that the Palestinian piece will be a very significant piece of it for the Saudis.
We're running out of time, and I have a bunch of great questions here. So we're going to do a bit of a lightning round.
Okay.
All right. You've been involved in this business for a few decades. You've had a terrific career, responsible for Iran, for Iraq, for the Gulf. You served in Jerusalem at one point, served in the White House the last couple of years as assistant secretary. What surprised you in the last post that you had that you didn't quite anticipate about this region that you know so well?
How many black swans it could produce at any given time. And we used to talk about that when I was here at the Washington Institute, that we tried to imagine what kind of black swan, which by itself is sort of an interesting intellectual exercise. By definition, a black swan is what you least expect. It flaps into view from nowhere. But we had a series of them. Of course, we had one truly terrible one, which was October 7th. But then all of the other events that came along the way in the last 15 months, one thing after another, the most, frankly, exhilarating one being the flight into exile of Bashar al-Assad.
Both good news and bad news.
Great news.
When you look back, what is an unheralded success? Something that doesn't get enough credit.
An unheralded success of this 4 years?
Of this 4 years.
Well, it's kind of the dog that didn't bark, to use that expression from Sherlock Holmes. The things that didn't happen. Now, we had some terrible things that happened. October 7th, we had the first state-on-state attacks by Iran on Israel. But so many things might have gotten so much worse across the region in this cauldron of the Gaza conflict and the spillover. And I was chided by a good friend of yours and mine, Nasser Bourita, the foreign minister of Morocco, when I saw him to say farewell. And he, before I could even start, he said, "Now I know you were sitting there thinking of all the things you didn't get done, and Secretary Blinken is thinking of all the things he didn't get done." He said, "That's exactly the wrong way to think about it. It's the things that you averted, the things that might have been so much worse for the region." And he cited Gaza, and yes, we weren't at the point then in late November being able to say that it would be over, but it was the things that we averted along the way. I think that's what you can't herald.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, even though of all the horrible news of the last 15 months, it could have been so much worse.
It could have spiraled completely out of control.
Major disappointment?
Oh, on the Palestinian front. Look, I think we regenerated the relationship with the Palestinian people and with the Palestinian leadership. But it would have been so much more satisfying to me leaving office if we could have, again, brought things onto a path of heading towards statehood and negotiated statehood, and a statehood that would be good for both peoples, I do believe.
Is there a risk out there that we need to take account of that we haven't adequately incorporated into our thinking?
Well, look, I think those of us who've been in government, who've been working on the Middle East for some years, we worry a lot about the fragility of the region, the same factors that brought turmoil in 2011, economic factors, the youth bulge, climate, and the terrible effects it's having across the region, and the sort of unsettled nature of governance in many of these states. The region is still fragile.
How worried are you that the region, that the Middle East, is a theater for great power competition, for Russians and Chinese to compete with us, to try to pick off allies or vulnerable states, and that the global competition will come and only exacerbate what is already a difficult regional situation?
Well, the global competition is there already, but it's a region that has seen competition among great powers for millennia. So some things never change. Russia's role is considerably reduced right now. Iran has been destabilized in the role that it had carved out for himself, but there's always the prospect of the empire striking back. And of course, China has its own predatory aspirations in the region as well.
I'm going to come away with this interview with being quite optimistic. I mean, you interspersed your comments by saying, well, peace between Israel and Saudi Arabia is possible. Syria, Israel, Lebanon, Israel. That's a pretty hopeful image for the future.
I am hopeful. It is going to take time. It is going to take a concerted effort to assist in the recovery of Gaza to start. and a larger recovery in the region. But no, I am hopeful. I am ever optimistic about this region.
So you've been involved in the transition, obviously, and I don't expect you to spill all the secrets here, but specific advice that that you think the Trump people, put aside whatever differences of ideology or whatever exist, advice to the new team, something they need to especially focus on. You better have it on your agenda early on, otherwise, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, look, I think there's no doubt in my mind. Stay engaged, but don't just stay engaged in part of the region. Stay engaged in those two very fragile places, Lebanon and Syria, which have such profound potential in them. And the changes there are going to radiate outwards. We already feel them. We have felt them in Iraq. There's a greater opportunity for these states to achieve agency, sovereignty, and with sovereignty comes stability and security. So stay engaged.
Stay engaged. Assistant Secretary Barbara Leaf, first of all, congratulations on a terrific tour of service. And thank you so much for joining us for this special conversation about America in the Middle East and where we can go forward to help bring about this hopeful set of opportunities that you've outlined. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
On Dakhel, Washington.
4, 3, 2, 1.